They used to call us gifts. That's the word they used in the old newsreels, the ones they still play in schools to show kids how Lincoln City got built. Men and women with their eyes lit up blue or gold or white, hauling steel beams through the air, sealing pipeline welds with a touch, pulling electrical current from the grid, and threading it through switchboards with their bare hands. The narration was warm back then, hopeful. Lincoln City, built by extraordinary people for an extraordinary future. I watched those reels in third grade, sitting in a classroom with chipped radiator paint and a projector that buzzed loud enough to make the film sound underwater. My mother watched them in third grade too, and she believed every word. She believed it the way people believe things when they're still young enough for it to cost them nothing. She told me once that the newsreel had made her feel proud, and that the pride had lasted until about the year she turned 16 and tried to get a licensed apprenticeship in city infrastructure, and was told the quota for power-registered apprentices in her district had been filled, which in practice meant it had never been opened. She told me this without anger, which I always thought was the most remarkable thing about her. By the time I was 26, that word gift had been replaced with another one. Problem. I am an electric. That means I can pull charge from any source within range and direct it, discharge it, shape it, push it through materials that should by rights resist it. At full draw, standing in the rain next to a live transformer, I can put out enough current to fuse a bank vault door or stop a man's heart from across a parking lot. I know the second one because it happened. I am not proud of knowing it. What I am on most mornings is cold. Lincoln City runs along a river that doesn't care about the season, and the work sites where they let unregistered powers pick up labor are always the exposed ones, the ones nobody else wants. Rooftop rebar, underwater conduit work, the inside of freight containers where the foreman doesn't have to watch. I kept my registration card stuffed inside my boot because if I wore it on my jacket like the law wanted, certain foremen would cut my daily rate in half. They knew what we were worth to them, just enough to keep us coming back, never enough for us to stop. The math of it was simple, and it never changed. Unregistered labor ran at 60% of the registered rate, which was already set below the industry floor, because the powers employment legislation had a carve-out that nobody ever explained clearly, and nobody with any power ever fixed. If you registered, you were subject to the assignment protocols. You could be directed to approved work sites only, which meant the foremen who did pay fair rates had waiting lists, and the ones who didn't had all the labor they needed. Either way, you ended up in the cold on a rooftop moving rebar. The Guardians made all of this worse in a specific way. Before they deployed the machines, a Powers neighborhood had a certain rough autonomy. The police had learned over decades that mass enforcement in a district with a high concentration of people with abilities was an exercise in damage you couldn't control. So they negotiated, informally, through intermediaries, through the kind of arrangements that never get written down but everyone understands. The Guardians changed that because machines don't negotiate. Machines don't notice the difference between arresting a man and arresting a situation. They run their threat assessment protocols, and they act on the output, and the output doesn't account for context. The first Guardian unit went into deployment in our district on a Tuesday in October, 3 years before the events I'm describing now. By Thursday, there had been 2 incidents. By the following Monday, the district council had filed an emergency injunction. The injunction was denied. By the end of that year, there were 14 Guardian units on patrol rotation, and the informal arrangements that had kept a rough peace were gone entirely, replaced by something colder and more precise, and less interested in whether you actually posed a threat or simply read as one. My mother's name was Mary. She was a cryo. She could lower the temperature of anything she touched, drain heat out of water until it went solid, seal a room down to freezing in under 2 minutes on a good day. She helped build 3 of the cooling systems still running in the hospital district. She got paid for 9 weeks of that work, and then the contracts went to automated units and she never got another call. By the time I'm talking about, she couldn't control it anymore. The cold was coming out of her unbidden, frost on the windowsills in July, ice rimming the edges of her mattress when she slept. The doctors had a name for it. The name cost $400 just to hear, and the treatment plan they outlined after cost more than I would earn in 4 years of rooftop work. They were not unkind about it. They just told me what it cost and handed me a form and left the room. I stood in that hallway for a long time. The city had a registry assistance fund. The fund had a 6 to 8 month waiting list. The fund also had a clause that denied claims for powers related to generation if the individual had a history of unregistered labor, which my mother did, because there had been years when the registered work dried up and the utility bills did not. So I walked out of that hospital and I stood in the parking structure and I pulled charge off the fluorescent strips overhead just to feel it move through me, just to remind myself what I was. The lights flickered and a woman passing by looked at me the way people look at something that isn't quite right, something that might go wrong at any moment. I didn't blame her. That was the week Garrett found me. He came to the worksite on a Tuesday. I noticed him because he was the kind of man you notice, not large, not loud, but with a quality of attention about him. He watched me work for 20 minutes before he walked over. He had a calm about him that I later learned was not peace but control. A TK, telekinetic, who had decided long ago that he would never let anything show on his face. He told me there was work, real work, not rooftop rebar. I told him I wasn't interested in anything that would bring guardians to my door. He said the guardians came to every door eventually. The only question was what you had when they arrived. I should have walked away. Every sensible part of me knew what he was describing and who he worked for and what that world cost the people who entered it. I had watched it cost people. I had attended the funerals, Denko Marsh, who I had worked 3 sites with, and who had been a pyro with a laugh you could hear from 2 floors down, dead at 23 in circumstances that the official report described as complications arising from a powers-related incident, and that everyone who knew him described as something else entirely. I had attended the funerals and told myself I was different, that I was doing it for my mother, that there was a line I would not cross and I knew exactly where it was. That is what everyone tells themselves, right up until the line moves. The guardians were the thing that made the math feel possible. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but follow it through. Before the machines, before the drones, a man with my abilities was a genuine threat to a police response. You cannot shoot electricity. You can try to contain it, but containing an electric in a space that has any current at all, any wire in the wall, any vehicle within 100 meters, is an exercise in wishful thinking. The old powers used to say we were the reason the law got made in the first place. Maybe. I don't know enough history to argue it. But the Guardians changed the equation. They were machines. They ran on power cells, not municipal grid. The first time I saw one up close, a patrol unit, 6 feet of composite alloy with a rotary stun cannon mounted on the right arm and a sensor cluster that could read biometric data through 2 layers of standard drywall. I felt the pull of it the way you feel the pull of anything massive and charged. All that stored energy. All those tight wound capacitors and relay banks. A Guardian unit at full charge held enough power to run a residential building for 2 days. To me, in the right conditions, it was a battery. It would take everything I had to short one out, but I could. That was what Garrett saw in me that day on the roof. Not a laborer, not a body to put in front of something dangerous. He saw a key, a very specific key for a very specific lock, and he had spent months looking for someone who could turn it. Marcus Sutcliffe ran the Lincoln City operation for an organization so old and entrenched that most people who dealt with it never used its name. He was a reader, a telepath of narrow but precise range, enough to catch surface thoughts, gauge reactions, feel the shape of a lie before it finished forming. He was polished in the way expensive things are polished. The shine was real, but it was a surface shine, and underneath it was hard use and harder purpose. I met him in a room above a restaurant that served food nobody ordered. He looked at me for 30 seconds without speaking. "You shorted the chemical plant fence in under 4 seconds," he said. "The rated load on that fence was 90 kilowatts." I didn't say anything. "Garrett says you can do more." He paused. "Garrett is rarely wrong about capability. He is sometimes wrong about character." He was reading me when he said it. I could see the slight unfocus in his eyes, the way a reader looks when they're skimming the surface of a room. I thought about my mother. I let him see that because it was real, and because real things are harder to argue with than anything I could have said. He nodded once. "Get him started," he told Garrett. The early jobs were small. A warehouse security system, a fleet tracking array. 3 times I sat in the back of a van and reached out through the floor of the thing and drained a Guardian unit's power cell down to nothing while Garrett's people moved past it. The machines would power cycle and come back up 60 seconds later, by which time we were gone. The draining felt different from what I did on the work sites. On the work sites it was channeled, directed, moving current along intended pathways and shaping it into something the job required. This was subtraction, reaching out to something large and full and pulling it empty. It left a residue in my hands, a tingling that lasted an hour, the way a muscle feels after you've pushed it past its usual range. I told myself each time that no one was getting hurt. I believed it the first time. By the third time, I was no longer asking myself the question. Garrett trained me in the margins of those months. He had a rooftop on the east side, nothing up there but an old HVAC unit and the city below, and he would push me until I was pulling current off car batteries 3 blocks away. He was a hard teacher. Not cruel, he never raised his voice, but relentless in the way that only people who have learned through failure become relentless. He had been in a detention facility for 18 months when he was 19 for a charge that in any other city, in any other decade, would have been dismissed. He never talked about it except once, briefly, when he told me that the experience had taught him the difference between a cage you can see and a cage you can't. He meant Lincoln City. He meant all of it. What I came to understand about Garrett's training, the deeper I got into it, was that he wasn't just teaching me range. He was teaching me precision. There's a difference between an electric who can pull massive current and discharge it, and an electric who can thread a targeted pulse through a specific relay while leaving the surrounding infrastructure untouched. The second kind is dangerous in a way the first kind simply isn't, because the second kind can be surgical. Garrett believed in surgery. He had no patience for collateral. That cost him, eventually. The precision that made him good at what he did also made it hard for him to accept the world that Marcus moved in, where collateral was not an accident but a method. I liked him. I want to be honest about that. In another life, in a city that worked the way the newsreels said it did, Garrett Kelton would have been something worth watching. He had the kind of mind that builds things, systems, connections. What Lincoln City gave him instead was a talent for violence and a gift for reading which way the hammer was going to fall. Maddie was the one who made the work feel human. She was a pyro, young, funny in a dry and specific way, and she had a habit of burning her fingertips against her thumb when she was nervous, just tiny flickers of heat she never seemed to notice. She could push fire in tight concentrated bursts that would cut through standard lock hardware faster than anything mechanical, and she could do it with enough control to leave the surrounding material untouched. She was better at her ability than most powers twice her age, and she carried it without any apparent ego about it, which in that world was unusual. She and Freddie had been running with Garrett for 2 years. Freddie didn't speak, whether by choice or condition I never knew, but he had a gentleness about him that sat strange against how strong he was. He could carry the frame of a transit van without the veins in his neck so much as rising. He used that strength carefully. I noticed that. The first time I saw him move something that should have required equipment, He did it with a deliberateness that made it look almost delicate, like he was aware at all times of the gap between what he could do and what the thing being moved could withstand. Nia I understood last. She stayed close to Marcus, and I read it wrong for weeks, read it as loyalty or affection or the simple proximity of people whose interests align. The truth was simpler and worse. She was a healer. She could take injury into her own body, absorb disease, bleed off the chemical wreckage of addiction. Marcus used her to manage his psych dependency the way you use a tool, regularly, without much consideration for the tool's experience of the process. Her father was in a detention facility. Marcus held the debt. She was the only genuinely good person in that building. I did not fully understand what that would cost until the end. Psych was the other thing that city ran on. It was synthesized from extracted spinal tissue, from powers from people with abilities, people who were picked up and processed in facilities that nobody who needed to know about them ever had to visit. The facilities existed in a kind of bureaucratic negative space. They weren't officially sanctioned, and they weren't officially prosecuted, because the people who ran the city understood, at the level where understanding is never spoken aloud, that the drug served a function. It kept a certain kind of desperation at a manageable pitch. It gave people a temporary wash of amplified sensation, something like what we felt when our abilities were running at full. For a few hours they could feel what it was to be more than they were. Then it wore off, and they needed more. Marcus was a distributor. He was not a manufacturer, and he was careful not to know too much about the manufacturing end, but the money that moved through him came from that process. I knew this by the end of the second month. I did not leave. I want to put that plainly. I knew, and I stayed, because my mother was worsening and the treatment fund had denied our claim, and I was 26 years old, and I had no other move left that I could see. There is no version of this that reflects well on me. I am not asking it to. The bank job came out of Marcus's desperation. His primary supply had been seized in a raid. Park and Davis, the two detectives working the Powers crime beat, had gotten lucky with a tip and hit a warehouse that Marcus had thought was clean. It wasn't. The trust that operated above Marcus in a structure none of us ever saw directly had sent word that the debt was due regardless. Marcus needed money fast, and the bank was the answer he had. We hit it on a cold Thursday morning. I went through the security system the way I'd learned, not brute force, but careful, a surgeon's touch, draining specific relays without triggering the redundancies. The vault itself was a problem. It ran on an independent power cell, sealed and grounded, and I had to work it from the inside of the thermal casing through a gap no wider than a maintenance port. It took 11 minutes. I was sweating through my jacket by the time the door moved. The vault held a tenth of what Marcus had been promised. He took the money anyway. He paid off what he could. It wasn't enough, and his superior, a man named Cumbo, whom I never saw face to face but whose name moved through the organization the way cold moves through a room, sent a response. The response was named Copperhead. I was not there when Copperhead came. I heard about it from Garrett, who had been there, who told me with his usual flat delivery that Rhino had handled it. Rhino was Marcus's primary muscle, a brawn with skin that turned kinetic impact at a density that made conventional firearms pointless. He was not a complicated man. He did what Marcus required, and he did it completely. What I understood from that exchange was that the situation had crossed from uncomfortable into genuinely dangerous, and the only direction Marcus could move was forward. The idea for the armored transport was mine. I want to own that. I have thought about it many times since, whether there was a version of me in those months who would have chosen differently, and I can't find him. My mother had a bad week. The doctors called it a cascade event, her control slipping, the cold radiating out of her despite every medication they were running, frost patterns on the ceiling above her bed, the nurses starting to ask questions about the ward temperature that we couldn't answer honestly. She looked smaller than she had. She looked like a woman who had already begun the process of letting go, and she was fighting it with everything she had, and it wasn't going to be enough. I came to Marcus with the transport plan, and I told him what I needed in return. I needed Nia. Not to keep, not as leverage. I needed a single session, one healing enough to stop the cascade and give my mother back her control. That was all I was asking for. Marcus heard me out, and he looked at me with those flat reader's eyes, and he said yes. Garrett saw it coming and tried to put conditions around it. He went to Marcus directly and told him that if this was going to work, he needed a full partnership. Real partnership, books, split, say in operations. Marcus agreed. In the room, looking at his face, I believed it. Garrett, who was smarter than I was about most things, chose to believe it also, because sometimes you believe things because you need them to be true. We ran the transport job on a gray afternoon in November. The route was a federally registered site confiscation, a seized supply being moved to a secure incineration facility under Guardian escort. The no-fly designation over the industrial corridor gave us a window. No drone-launched Guardian reinforcements for 11 minutes once the perimeter triggered. We needed 8. We hit the convoy at the corridor's midpoint. I took the 2 lead Guardian units off the grid in sequence, 4 seconds each, clean enough that the shutdown read as power cell failure rather than hostile contact. Garrett held the transport vehicle in place with a sustained TK push. I had seen him stop moving vehicles before, but never something that heavy, and he held it steady for 40 seconds while Maddie worked the rear lock and Freddie positioned at the side door. It was the cleanest we had ever run. We moved like a unit that had trained together, and in those 40 seconds I felt something that I am not proud to admit. I felt good at this. I felt the particular cleanness of a thing done well, ability meeting preparation, timing locking into place. For 40 seconds I forgot that this was what it was. Then Marcus's other crew, the ones we hadn't known were there, the ones who had been positioned since before we arrived, opened fire on the escort officers. I heard Maddie first, a sound that wasn't a scream, more like surprise, like a question, like her body asking her what had just happened. Then I saw her go down and I understood. I took 3 steps toward her before I understood the fuller shape of it, the angles, the positions of the second crew, the fact that the fire was targeted and the targeted positions included ours. They weren't shooting at us directly, not yet, but the message was clear in the geometry. Move toward Maddie and enter a field of fire position to remove witnesses. I stopped. I stood in the middle of that corridor and I stopped moving and I let the current run through me until my hands were burning with it and I held it there. Every vehicle in range, every power cell, the overhead lines running along the corridor's rail infrastructure. I pulled it all and I held it and I did not discharge it because what I was looking at was not a target. It was a choice. Marcus's men had already taken the supply. Rhino was at the vehicle loading. The escort officers were down. I didn't know yet which ones were dead and which weren't. I learned that later and I have not forgotten the number. Garrett was at my shoulder. I don't know when he got there. We need to move, he said, quiet, no inflection. I released the current. Slowly. Not a discharge, just a release, letting it bleed back into the surrounding grid, returning it to where I'd pulled it from. It took about 4 seconds. Freddie was still standing when I reached him. He had taken 3 rounds that should have stopped him and he was still standing. And he looked at me with something in his eyes that I could not read. And then his legs gave and he went down slowly, like a building being demolished by someone who knows what they're doing. I held his hand. I don't know why I'm telling you that. I held his hand for about 4 seconds and then Garrett was pulling me to the vehicle and we were moving. We drove in silence for a long time. Garrett was the one who said it finally. His voice had the quality it always had, controlled level, a man who had decided a long time ago that emotion was a liability he couldn't afford. He knew the moment you made the demand. You asked for Nia. That told him you were committed. Committed enough to run a job that size without room to back out. He knew you'd ask for partnership, I said. Yes. He was never going to give it to you. No. There was a long pause. Outside the windows, Lincoln City moved past in its usual gray business. People at bus stops, guardians on patrol rotation, their sensor clusters tracking faces. A woman in a yellow coat walking a dog that was pulling hard toward a fenced lot. The ordinary ongoing fact of the place. "Maddie," I said. "Yes." That was all either of us said about it for a while. Here is the thing about a man like Garrett. He does not grieve the way most people grieve. He grieves in the operational layer. He starts thinking about what went wrong and how to correct for it, and the grief lives inside that process, invisible but load-bearing, holding everything else up. I recognized it because I did the same thing and because grief, I had learned, was not a separate activity. It was what you did the work on top of. He had contacts, old ones from before Marcus, from the years when he'd been trying to build something legitimate on the east side. One of those contacts had a line to Detective Park. I want to be careful about how I describe Park. He was not a good cop in the easy television sense. He was a cop who had worked the Powers crime beat long enough to understand that the system he was enforcing was not neutral, that the guardians and the registration laws and the denial clauses in the assistance funds all pointed in a specific direction, and that the direction was not justice. He had put people away for things that, in any other city in any other decade, would have warranted a social worker and a second chance. He knew this. He had been doing the job long enough that the knowledge had settled into something below his daily decisions, not informing them exactly, but present underneath them, the way foundation cracks are present underneath a floor that looks fine from above. He had a daughter who was a TK, 7 years old and already afraid of what she was. That was the context I didn't know when I first sat across from him in an interview room 3 weeks before the transport job, brought in for questioning about the chemical plant fence. That was the thing that sat behind his eyes when he looked at me and chose not to plant the evidence his partner Davis wanted to plant. Davis was a simpler story. Davis wanted clean numbers and didn't much care how they got that way. Park had apparently spent years navigating that partnership with the kind of careful patience that costs a person something every day. He let me go because he had no evidence and because he wasn't yet willing to manufacture it. I understood later that it was also, in part, because he looked at me in that room and read something there. Not the way a reader reads, not telepathically, just the ordinary human practice of looking at someone carefully and understanding what you're looking at. He read a man doing something wrong for reasons that weren't simple, and he made a judgment call. I hope his daughter is all right. I never got to ask him. I gave him Marcus's location, the supply house on the Eastern Industrial Grid, the sub-level storage, the access codes for the security systems. I gave it to him cleanly and without conditions, because the conditions were already set by what I was going to do next. Garrett and I went in, while the police response was still inbound. Rhino was in the corridor. He came at us without ceremony, no words, no posturing, just movement. A large man accelerating into a space that was suddenly very small. Garrett hit him with a sustained TK burst that would have thrown a standard vehicle 40 feet, and Rhino skidded back 3 steps. 3 steps. His skin did what it was designed to do, and the kinetic impact distributed across the surface without penetrating. I had seen Braun-class powers before. I had never seen one that could take a full TK burst from Garrett and stay upright. He looked at us with a professional's assessment, not anger, calculation. He was deciding which one of us was the greater threat, and he decided correctly. He came at me. I let him get close. I want to explain this because it matters. What I did to Rhino was not something I am proud of. It was necessary in the way that some things are necessary, which does not mean they should be comfortable to remember. His skin stopped kinetic impact. It distributed force. What it couldn't fully distribute was current. Electricity doesn't care about the armor. It cares about the conductor beneath it. And beneath that skin was a nervous system that was completely ordinary. I put current through his nervous system. Not enough to stop his heart, but enough to override motor function, enough to put him on the floor and keep him there. He went down hard and he stayed down, and I stood over him and felt the charge still running through my hands, and I made myself pull it back. I made myself stop. That matters. I want you to understand that it matters. Marcus was at the back of the facility. He was a reader, so he knew we were coming. He had felt the situation changing in the way that readers feel the weight of a room shift, all those surface thoughts accumulating into a single clear signal. It's over. He was standing next to a window when we came through the door, and he looked at us with something that might have been relief. Readers are strange that way. The ones who go deep into other people's minds eventually develop a quality of isolation that looks like calm. There's nothing left to surprise them. They've already felt the edge of every conversation before it reaches its sharpest point. I had been around Marcus enough by then to understand that his particular brand of control was not strength, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had read too many rooms and found the same things in all of them, and had long since stopped being disappointed by the findings. He looked at me first, not Garrett. He stayed on my face for a long moment, and I felt the slight unfocus of his eyes, the reader's skim, and I let him see whatever he was looking for. I was empty of anything complicated at that moment. I was thinking about Maddie. I was thinking about Freddie's hand. I let him see that. Then he looked at Garrett. He said something to Garrett that I didn't hear fully. I was watching the door. What I caught was the word partners, and the particular flat way Garrett didn't respond to it. What Garrett said back after a pause that lasted long enough for the police response to move another floor closer was this: "You should have left my people out of it. You could have been honest about what you were using us for. I would have done the job anyway. I needed the money the same as you needed the distraction." He paused. "Instead, you killed Maddie. You killed Freddie. And now every cop in the city knows our faces and thinks we executed those escort officers." Marcus said something I also didn't hear. "I know," Garrett said. "You already knew I was going to say that." Then Marcus was down, and it was over, and the police were coming through the front, and Garrett was standing over Marcus holding something that I could see in his face he had needed to hold for a long time. Not satisfaction. Something more exhausted than that. The face of a man who has done the necessary thing and found that it didn't feel the way he needed it to feel. He took the psych. Not all of it. The police had what was in the facility, but the transport supply, the confiscated product from the convoy, he had secured separately before we went in. He looked at me when he had it and he said, "Your end of this is done. Get Nia." I found her in the room at the back. She was sitting on the floor, which told me she already knew what had happened. Nia moved through the world in a state of constant peripheral awareness. Working for a reader had done that to her, the habit of reading rooms before rooms read you. I told her my mother was in the hospital. I told her what was happening to her. She looked at me for a long time. There was no hostility in it. There was something much worse than hostility, which was understanding. She already knew what I was going to say next. She had been waiting for someone to say it for months, maybe years, the demand, the inevitable demand that her ability made inevitable, because healers in Lincoln City were not people. They were resources, and resources get used. She said, "You know what it does to me." I knew. I had known for weeks. A healer takes the damage into their own tissue, takes the disease, the injury, the accumulated cellular failure of whatever they're treating and absorbs it. The body processes it, usually. In cases of degenerative power loss, the prognosis for the healer was not simple. It was not safe. She said, "I'm not asking you not to. I know your mother. I know what she is to you. I'm asking you to understand what you're asking." I stood there in that room, and I held the moment the way you hold something you know is going to break. I thought about my mother in that hospital bed with the frost on the ceiling. I thought about the 8-year-old version of me watching her build things with her hands, ice sculptures in the backyard in summer just because she could, just because She wanted to show me what it looked like when a gift was simply a gift, before the laws and the forms and the assistance fund denial letters. I thought about Nia's father in a detention facility, a debt she'd been paying with her body for years, because no one had thought to give her another option. I put my hand down, not toward her, just down. "No," I said, "go." She looked at me. "Your truck is in the lower lot. Keys are in the left wheel well. Take it and go north. Don't come back to Lincoln City." I paused. "I'm sorry for all of it. I'm sorry I came here to do what I came here to do." She left without another word. I listened to her footsteps go down the corridor and through a door, and then there was no more sound. I went to the hospital. My mother was asleep when I got there. The frost was thin on the windowsill, thinner than it had been the day before, a good sign, maybe, or maybe just the medication cycling. I sat in the chair by her bed and I watched her breathe, and I thought about all the small decisions that had brought me to that chair that night, the thousand small yes answers that had compounded into something I would spend the rest of my life carrying. She woke up near dawn and she looked at me and she said, "You look like you've been somewhere." "I have," I said. She didn't ask where. She had spent 26 years being my mother, and she knew when to ask and when to let a thing settle. She reached out and put her hand on mine. Her skin was cold. It was always cold now. She died 11 days later. Not from violence. Not from anything anyone did or failed to do in those final hours of that operation. The cascade had progressed past the point where even conventional treatment could have reversed it, and she let go on a Tuesday morning with snow coming down outside the window and my hand in hers. I want to be clear about this because I've had a long time to be clear about it. She did not die because I refused to use Nia. She was already past that threshold. The doctors told me so afterward when I asked, because I needed to know, because I needed to understand the weight of the choice I had made. The healer could have given her weeks, maybe a month, and at a cost that I had already decided I couldn't justify making someone else pay for my account. I walked out of that hospital and I went to the precinct, and I turned myself in. Park was on duty. He took me through booking without making anything out of it, no speech, no weighing of the situation in front of me, no visible calculation of what I had cost him or given him. Just procedure, clean and quiet. When we were in the processing room, with the camera in the corner that he had positioned himself so he was partially blocking, he said one thing. "My daughter asked me last week if the ban passes, whether she'll have to leave." I didn't say anything. I told her I didn't know. That was the honest answer. He looked at the form on the desk in front of him. "You shorting those Guardian units, the transport corridor, the whole operation." He paused. "People saw that, Power's doing that. It's not helping the vote." "I know," I said. He nodded once. "Sign here." I signed. I spent 14 months in the facility before the hearing. That's another story, long, mostly dull in the way that institutional time is dull, punctuated by things I'd rather not dwell on here. I learned to sleep in blocks. I learned which walls were concrete and which were standard partition, which matters to an electric for reasons you can probably guess. I learned that a facility housing Power's offenders is designed with that in mind. The power supply runs on isolated DC loops instead of AC grid, specifically to reduce the draw radius for electrics. It worked mostly. I had maybe a third of my normal range. Enough to feel the building around me, not enough to do much with it. I did not use my abilities in that facility. Not once. Not to open a door, not to dim a light, not for any purpose whatsoever. This required more from me than anything else I describe in this account. I want to be precise about that. Every morning I woke up and I could feel the building's electrical systems the way you feel air temperature, constant, ambient, insistent. Every morning I chose not to reach, not because I couldn't and not because I was afraid, but because I had made a decision that my abilities were not a tool for convenience or even for necessity, unless the necessity was someone else's life. I had used them as tools for Marcus. I had used them for money, for my mother, for the job. The problem with tools is that the hand holding them tends to become the hand that knows how to hold them, and that knowledge reshapes the hand. I was trying to reshape it back. The guards were not uniformly bad people. Some were. The warden ran a clean facility by the technical definition, and a hard one by any human definition. The other powers inmates were a cross-section of Lincoln City's failure. People who had gotten desperate, people who had gotten recruited, people who had made one clear-eyed decision and found themselves here because the decision was the only available move, and the system doesn't distinguish between coercion and choice when it's writing the charge. I did not tell them about the heist, about Freddie or Maddie or Marcus or the transport corridor. I told them I was an electric who had made some bad calls. They accepted this. In that place, everyone was an electric or a TK or a pyro who had made some bad calls. The specific calls were not usually discussed. I thought about Nia sometimes, wondered where she had gone, whether the truck had made it north, whether her father had been processed out of the facility she'd mentioned, and whether she'd found him. I had no way to know, and I tried not to make up versions of the answer. I let it be uncertain because uncertainty was the honest thing. Garrett, I heard later through the kind of news that moves through facilities without any official channel, had taken over the trust operation in Lincoln City, had handed Cumbo the supply, and made himself the new face of the thing he had been working for. I don't know if he did it because he believed he could run it differently, or because it was simply the available step forward, the next rung on the structure he'd been climbing since he was 19 years old in a cell not so different from mine. I think about it sometimes. I don't have a conclusion. What I know about Garrett is this. He was not wrong about everything he believed. He was right that Lincoln City was a cage. He was right that the law was not neutral and the guardians were not just policing crime, but managing a population that the city had decided to treat as a liability. He was right that no one was coming to fix it from above. All of that was true. He was wrong about the cost of his response to those truths. He was wrong in the way that people are wrong when they've been hurt long enough, that the hurt becomes the foundation of their reasoning, and every structure they build sits on top of the hurt and inherits its angles. You can construct entirely valid logic on a compromised foundation, and every step of the reasoning can be correct, and the building can still lean in a direction that eventually falls on someone. Garrett's building fell on Maddie. It fell on Freddie. It fell on Nia, on her father, on every person in Lincoln City who was using psych and whose dependency was now being managed by the same trust that had been managing it before, with a different name running the local operation. The city's cage changed its warden and kept its bars, and Garrett understood this, and did it anyway because the alternative was to have no power at all. And he had decided a long time ago that powerlessness was the condition he would not accept. I understand the decision. I have thought about it for 14 months in a facility designed to take away the specific kind of power that I have, and I understand it more clearly now than I could have said to his face that night. I am not sure understanding it makes it less wrong. I think those two things can both be true. The powers ban vote was still 3 weeks out when I surrendered. I didn't know which way it would go, and I didn't think about it much, because the larger shape of my situation at that point was that I had a hearing to prepare for, and my mother to bury, and exactly nothing else in the immediate future that required strategic thinking. I want to be clear about this because I've had a long time to be clear about it. She did not die because I refused to use Nia. She was already past that threshold. The doctors told me so afterward when I asked, because I needed to know, because I needed to understand the weight of the choice I had made. The healer could have given her weeks, maybe a month, and at a cost that I had already decided I couldn't justify making someone else pay for my account. I walked out of that hospital and I went to the precinct, and I turned myself in. Park was on duty. He took me through booking without making anything out of it, no speech, no weighing of the situation in front of me, no visible calculation of what I had cost him or given him. Just procedure, clean and quiet. When we were in the processing room, with the camera in the corner that he had positioned himself so he was partially blocking, he said one thing. "My daughter asked me last week if the ban passes, whether she'll have to leave." I didn't say anything. I told her I didn't know. That was the honest answer. He looked at the form on the desk in front of him. "You shorting those Guardian units, the transport corridor, the whole operation." He paused. "People saw that, Power's doing that. It's not helping the vote." "I know," I said. He nodded once. "Sign here." I signed. I was 26 when I went in. I was 27 when I came out. The vote on the Powers ban failed by 11%. There were people in the streets the night the count came in, most of them ordinary citizens who had made the connection at some point between the thing they feared and the thing they also, quietly, needed, who had looked at the history of Lincoln City, at those old newsreels they played in school, and understood that the city they lived in had been built by the same hands it was now legislating against. I don't know if my case was part of what moved those numbers. I hope it wasn't. I would prefer the outcome not to have been connected to what I did. The park near the courthouse was full that night. I watched from across the street, from a bench near the transit stop, with my jacket collar up because the wind off the river was sharp, and I was still getting used to being in open space again without anyone telling me I couldn't move. A little girl was sitting on her father's shoulders near the edge of the crowd. She was maybe 7 years old. She had her arms out for balance, and her father was holding her ankles and laughing at something she'd said. And then, just for a moment, she seemed to feel the electricity in the crowd, the press of all those bodies and voices, and her eyes lit up the faint, specific blue-white of a TK who doesn't know yet that they're doing it, who just feels something and reaches without thinking. Her father felt it. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. There was a half-second of something worry maybe on her face, the old instinct, hide it, put it away, don't let them see. And he squeezed her ankles once, 2 pulses, firm and deliberate, a signal, "You're all right, I've got you." Her arms came down. She settled onto his shoulders, and she turned back to the crowd with her face wide open, not hiding anything. I sat on that bench for a long time after they walked away. My mother used to say that the things that get built in a generation take 3 generations to unbuild, and 3 more to build right. She said this without bitterness. She said it the way engineers say things about materials, about the actual behavior of actual systems, with respect for the difficulty of the problem and no illusions about quick solutions. She was right about a lot of things. I think about her hands the most. Cold hands always, even before the degeneration. Even when she was healthy and working and building the cooling systems that still run under the hospital district. She used to say that the cold was just the other side of what she could do, that you couldn't have the ability without the temperature, that anyone who told you the gift came without the cost was selling you something. She was a practical woman. She didn't romanticize what we were. She would have hated the word gift. She would have said we were people. Just people who could do specific things, the same as people who can do math or carry a tune or know instinctively how to talk someone down from a ledge. Abilities on a longer scale. Genetic expressions that the city had needed badly enough to build its skyline on, and then decided when the automation came in that it no longer had a use for. The city didn't hate us, she would have said. That would have required the city to care. Cities don't care. People in cities care, or they don't. And the ones who don't tend to write the policies, and the ones who do tend to wait in lines. She had been waiting in lines her entire adult life. She did it without complaint and without the particular bitterness that some people develop when they understand the system clearly, and can see that the system sees them just as clearly and has made its decision about their value. She just kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept believing, not in institutions. She wasn't naive about institutions, but in the slower, more stubborn thing underneath them. The fact that people are still people when you get them out of the line and into the same room and ask them a direct question. I think she was right about that too. I think she was right about most things, and I was too young and too angry most of the time to stop and receive what she was offering. Just people, with a registration card in the boot, and a mother in the hospital, and a foreman who looked through you at the rate he was going to pay. I got work the month after I got out. Not rooftop work. There's a facility in the East District, an electrical infrastructure company, licensed for powers employment, doing grid maintenance on the transformer banks along the river corridor. The pay is not good. It is not the worst I have been paid. I don't carry the registration card in my boot anymore. I wear it on my jacket the way the law requires. A small thing. Most days it doesn't cost me anything. Some days someone looks at it and their face does the thing that faces do, that slight micro-expression of recalculation, and I hold the draw of everything running through the lines around me and I breathe and I let it settle. I haven't used my abilities for anything but the job in 14 months. I think about the convoy sometimes. I think about the flash of it, the two Guardian units going dark in sequence, the clean certainty of the draw, the feeling of being at full capacity, which is a feeling unlike most other feelings. Not good, exactly, but real. Completely real in the way that only things that use your whole self feel real. I think about Freddie going down slowly. I think about Nia's footsteps down the corridor. I think about the little girl on her father's shoulders, her eyes lighting up for half a second before she remembered to be afraid. I am not at peace with what I did in those months. I don't expect to be. I made choices that I made for reasons that felt like necessity at the time and looked like something more complicated from this distance. I helped move drugs that were made from people. I disabled law enforcement. I put current through a man's nervous system in a hallway in an industrial building on the east side of a city that was already failing the people it was built on. I let my mother die without the one thing that might have extended her life, because the cost of that thing was not mine to charge to someone else. That last one I can live with. The others I carry the way you carry anything heavy, not by pretending it isn't there, and not by letting it be all there is, but by moving forward under the weight of it and seeing how far the day gets you. Lincoln City is still Lincoln City. The Guardians still patrol. The vote failed, but the political pressure is building again, and next cycle there will be another vote and another. The psych trades shifted and redistributed as trades do when you remove one distribution node, and there are people in this city who are still being processed in facilities I don't know the addresses of. I know my limits now. I know the difference between the things I can change and the things I can put my hand against and push, and they will not move. My mother knew that difference. She just didn't have time to finish teaching it to me. I work on the transformer banks along the river corridor, and when the current runs through my hands I feel the draw of it, the old familiar pull, the simple fact of what I am. On clear days you can see the skyline from the maintenance walkway, the buildings my mother's generation built, the cooling towers and the spire of the civic center and the hospital district gleaming on the south side of the river. She helped build 3 of those cooling systems. They're still running. That has to be enough. For today, that has to be enough.